Oftentimes, the ideas we have about certain things are taken for granted and are never investigated to their fullest extent. And I believe this is exactly what's happening in the criticism of the GOP over disaster relief for Hurricane Ian. So, for those of you who may not be acquainted, there was recently a debate in Congress about a bill that, among many other things, would provide billions of dollars in disaster relief for areas like Florida, which, just as the posting of this video, was racked by Hurricane Ian. And of course, every single Florida Republican in the House of Representatives voted against the bill. And this, amongst other things, caused a huge firestorm in the media. It caused a massive firestorm on Twitter, with a lot of people, a lot of leftists on Twitter saying that it's evil for Republicans to vote against disaster relief. Marco Rubio, who voted against disaster relief years ago because, in his words, there was a lot of pork in the disaster relief bill for the hurricane he voted against, he was also criticized extensively as well, as was Florida Senator Rick Scott. The New York Times ran a piece recently saying that some Republicans voted against disaster relief and didn't acknowledge climate change sufficiently, but now they want help with Hurricane Ian. So there's been this sort of about face among some Republicans, but still a very stalwart anti-disaster relief attitude amongst other Republicans. And they have been getting ripped apart in the media. The Daily Beast said that Hurricane Ian reveals the GOP's disaster relief hypocrisy. They want to have it both ways. They want to vote against disaster relief sometimes, and then other times they want it when their state gets hit. This is the basic thesis underlying these critiques. So, when I examine these arguments, I noticed one thing that's not really being talked about, and that is the merits of federal disaster relief beyond a monetary context. You see, a lot of people talk about these big abstract numbers. Oh, we're giving $44 billion to FEMA for disaster relief. And they don't actually talk about the presumptions that go before these big abstract concepts. It is hard for the human mind to conceptualize that amount of money. But it's not hard for the human mind to conceptualize justification for certain ideas if those justifications are made clear. My friends, an argument itself is not important. The most important thing about a claim is not the argument it makes. The most important thing about a claim are the set of claims that would need to be true for it to be true. So the most important thing about what someone says is not what they say, it's what is required for what they say to be true. So if I say I am in the car driving, you can presuppose a few things. Number one, there is a car. Number two, I can get in the car. Number three, I have the ability, or at least some capacity, to drive. And number four, the car has the ability to work because I'm driving it. If it didn't work, I couldn't drive it. And that's just a simple statement. But when it gets to more complex issues like disaster relief, these are sacred cows that are never actually thought about. Kind of like Social Security, kind of like Medicare and Medicaid, all these government programs that a lot of people, even people on the right, benefit from, they never actually consider, are these programs founded on sound and moral argumentation? The truth is, my friends, federal disaster relief is premised on a set of ideas that say things about justice, charity, and moral obligation that, when you actually look at those things under the lens of scrutiny, they fall apart. Nancy Pelosi said a set of Republicans who voted against disaster relief don't think the government has a role to help people. Therefore, they should be voted out of office. She said this on Twitter. Now, despite the fact that the government was never meant to be a helping hand, it was always meant to be a rights protection agency that had as little intervention in American society as possible. Despite that basic civics lesson that Nancy Pelosi is forgetting, this is an idea that is widely held to be true amongst many Americans, even Americans who may be on the right side of things, who may be right-leaning. But it is a false idea, the idea that the government has to help you. Therefore, this justifies a lumbering bureaucratic agency like FEMA, and also justifies the government getting involved in disaster relief efforts. The truth is, my friends, when the government is involved in anything, there will always be secondary, tertiary, and other kind of political interests. This was Marco Rubio's justification for voting against the hurricane relief bill that he voted against a long time ago. He said the bill had pork in it. The bill that was most recently passed included billions of dollars, not just for hurricane relief, but also for climate change related stuff as well, and other measures that really had nothing to do with the hurricane. So instead of actually just simply laying out hurricane relief and saying we're going to vote on hurricane relief, they decided to vote on hurricane relief and 10 other things that had nothing to do with hurricane relief. And yet, because people have uncritically accepted the idea that the government is there to help you, they will look at that bill and they'll phrase it in that way. And any attempt to go against that bill is an attempt not to help people. That is how the thought process goes. What's the problem with this? Number one, as I mentioned, the government has secondary interests that may not even involve helping people, but involve things to which something like helping people is convenient. The government is a parasite. The government takes and it does not give. It takes. And what it gives to you, it gives to you because you consent to it. It gives to you because you allow it, because it's supposed to, but it doesn't create anything of its own. It requires your money and your consent to exist. Now, if the government exists because of your money and your consent, that means that almost everything, not everything, but almost everything the government does can be and has been replicated by the broader society. This is the second point I'm going to make. Disaster relief presumes the role of helping your fellow man rests on the shoulders of the government, when in fact, that first rests on the shoulders of society. Government is an agency meant to protect society. It is not meant to manage society. Human beings existing in a social context, we are the people who help others in society. We are the people who show camaraderie to our fellow man. And whenever a hurricane happens, you have numerous private entities arising to the occasion to actually help society. The Red Cross, the Salvation Army. In Florida, you have the Florida Disaster Relief Fund, which is a private organization that sometimes works with the government, but also works with non-government institutions. You got the Humane Society that helps animals when they need help in these disasters. You got so many different social institutions that rise up, and yet people forget that when the government steps in and regulates anything, they are reducing the ground for social institutions to actually be effective. The more the government advances on a particular issue, the less power social institutions have, because social institutions do not have a monopoly on force. Government has a monopoly on force and is not subject to the rules of society like someone who is running a disaster relief shelter is. Instead, they think they set the rules and can therefore isolate themselves from all competition, from all correction, and this is why there's so much waste and corruption in government, because ultimately it is accountable to itself. No matter how much they tell you, you can change things by voting. Sometimes you can. Other times you really can't, because there are certain motifs and themes that are baked into how the political structure operates that voting only perpetuates. You see? So if we understand that more government in society reduces the amount of things that social institutions can do, why would we think that the government is the primary caregiver for society? That's not the case. That's a contradiction in terms. An institution that erodes social capability cannot also be its primary caregiver. But also, the presumptions I mentioned about justice and charity also must be taken into account as well. It is the government's job to ensure the principles of justice reign supreme throughout the land. Justice being understood as the principle which justifies the individual ownership of property, the protection of individual rights, the preservation of contracts between individuals. That is justice, and government is concerned with protecting that. But justice does not originate from the government. The government does not have an imperative by virtue of justice to go ahead and help people in a disaster, but rather that is simply a benevolence that comes from caring about your fellow man. It is not a moral obligation to help someone during a disaster, but it is a good thing to do if you can do so without risking harm to yourself. The philosopher Lord Keynes divided virtues into two categories: primary virtues and secondary virtues. Keynes said things like justice, which are essential to the preservation of society, are primary virtues. But secondary virtues are things like charity and benevolence, things that are good to do, but are not required. And these things rest in society. But if the government advances upon society and decides not only will we protect justice, but we will now distribute justice, this is the idea of distribute justice, this is the idea of social justice, we will now distribute justice, the government is now impeding your ability as an individual to make an impact in your community, even if it's ever so slightly. That is the problem. Federal disaster relief ignores this dynamic. It ignores the parasitic nature of government. It ignores the origin of morality and benevolence, which comes from the social realm and ultimately makes its way to government, but government does not manage it. It ignores all of this because so many people have an emotional attachment to government help. That's what's going on here. That's the real deal here. If there were no government disaster relief, would it be reasonable to believe that there would be no help for those who go in disasters? Of course not. There would still be plenty of help. Now, would that help probably be... Actually, I wouldn't even say that help would be less organized, because it wouldn't be less organized. There are sophisticated social networks which exist solely to protect people, and there have been these networks for almost all of American society. Of course, they developed and everything. Government has only secondarily came into this realm in the 1920s, or even a little bit before that, during the Progressive Era, when the government expanded its Rolodex of things that it decides to do. But the premise is never questioned. The presupposition is never questioned. The role of government is never questioned. The meaning of justice and charity are never questioned. We can accept ideas that have a bunch of presumptions and yet never challenge those presumptions, and thus never understand the ideas. And those who are saying that Republicans are bad because they vote against disaster relief don't understand the dynamics that go into this disaster relief thing, and they also don't understand that first and foremost, benevolence and charity originate in society because these are virtues that exist in an interpersonal context. The government is not an interpersonal force per se. It is not the creator of social relationships. The man's understanding of his own limitations and his desire to keep his property, his self-interest, all of these things come together to create social relationships. If you understand this, then you would understand that the moral implication of disaster relief rests solely in the goodwill of individuals and not in the bureaucratic management of FEMA and other agencies. Some of you may say, well, Christian, why didn't you talk about the waste, the fraud, and the abuse? That's secondary. If I could imagine a government agency doing disaster relief without waste, fraud, or abuse, would that make that agency just? Would that therefore assign goodwill and benevolence to the government? Would that make it a caretaker as opposed to an agent of protection? No, it wouldn't. But the principle that says the government is a caregiver and not an agent, which is a distortion of the ethos of the American experiment, which is a distortion of the American Revolution's goal in setting up the government, which is a distortion of the Constitution, a distortion of all of those things, it would behoove me to address that before I address anything else. So let me summarize what I'm trying to say. There is no moral imperative, as in there is no moral basis for the government to do disaster relief, because goodwill and benevolence, the two principles from which disaster relief and the desire to help your fellow man arise, belong squarely in society. And the more the government encroaches upon society, the less society can do to help itself, the less free we are, and the less productive things like disaster relief are from a social context. You cannot have a robust society and a massive government all at once. You must pick one or pick none at all, or else things tend to disharmony. Things go to pot. That's the point. Think on it, my friends. I love you guys so much. If you love me, please sure to subscribe to this channel, Like this video, share this video, comment on this video, tell me your thoughts. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.